Ladies and gentlemen, we're now moving towards the last session of our two-day conference. We're waiting for our chief guest, who is the Chairman Senate, Syed Yusuf Raza Gilani. As you wait for him, I'm going to request the other three speakers alongside him to please join me on stage, and we'll just start the session immediately. Can I request Mr. Shakil Masood, the CEO of DawnNews, to come up? Ms. Pernil Ironside from UNICEF Pakistan. And lastly, Ms. Aban Markar Kabraji, the Senior Regional Expert Climate and Environment at UNEP Asia. Please. Aban, would you like to start with your address?
Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. And I start with a small caveat. I've just been given the notes of the last 2 days. So you'll excuse me if I skip a few things and maybe run through a few others. I've been asked to do a quick synopsis of what we heard and of the discussions that we've had and the various issues that came up since yesterday morning. And great credit to the team and of course Dawn itself for having put this event together and having the very high quality of speakers. I really have been very impressed, and I go to many, many conferences all over the world, and it does Pakistan proud to have an event like this and to have people like you participating and speaking. So I think a great, Dawn, Shakil, you represent Dawn there today. And more about, the way this conference can be positioned in terms of thought process and an advocacy process in the region, but I'll get to that later. So starting with the kinds of things we heard, I thought that what would be useful to just identify that there were 2 or 3 themes that appeared again and again and knit everything together and demonstrated the holistic nature of the challenge we're facing with climate. It is said again and again that climate affects us all, it affects our lives, it affects the planet, it affects everything we do. But there are specific things that ran through that which brought that sense of cohesion, coherence, and also unity, if that's how we want to see it, or dissonance and conflict, which is another way of seeing it as well, particularly when we talk about the big shift that we're going to have to make from fossil fuels to renewables. One of the things that came up again is that when we look at climate in Pakistan, inevitably everything is influenced by our geography. Where we sit on the planet, where we are positioned, the sort of geography we have with our mountains, our ocean, our rivers. And of course, the system that came into focus again and again in terms of its resources and how they are managed was the Indus Basin, and the resource under greatest stress being water. So I'd like to, look at what we heard in that context and take it back again and again to the geography of the Indus, the systems of the Indus, and how it's influenced our lives and this land for many thousands of years. And linked to that, the second theme that I think came through very strongly was food security. Because what does water do? It brings us life. And that kind of life depends on agriculture, water itself, marine fisheries. We didn't hear too much about the coasts. That's the one thing I think perhaps was missing in this. We heard about the mangroves, but not about the coast. And perhaps that is something we should focus on a little bit longer, because we have a very impressive coastline and a delta. The second thing, the third thing that I think also was very important was again and again the paradigm shift that was needed as we move to green technology. And underpinning all of that was the issue of finance. And finance, led by what the finance minister said, I think specifically came through as development finance. We talk about climate finance, but climate finance at its core is development finance. It's the way we resource and we restructure the way our banks function, the way the industry functions, the way insurance functions, the way the finance ministries function, and, the provinces and the allocations and the ADPs. That's really what it all comes down to. Within that, sectorally or thematically, we went through the following themes. One was the accepted and inevitable reference to climate injustice, to vulnerability, and the kinds of responsibilities, who bears responsibility for what. I really don't think that's much of a debate any longer. Everybody accepts, particularly with the setting up of the Loss and Damage Fund, that there is climate injustice, there has been, it's historical, but ultimately we are all impacted, and the blame game can only bring us perhaps some resources at a great deal of negotiation. The solutions that we look for, since climate affects us, are indigenous and need to be found, and our solutions will save us. Wherever the resources we get from, ultimately it has to be Pakistanis who save Pakistan. I think that's one of the aspects that has come through, and with that came equity and development in the context of our own nation. The second, and I go really by the sessions as they went through the days, was the integration of adaptation, because we're not really in a climate prevention scenario anymore. We are close to 1.5. We're likely to go above it. We have gone above it at certain times of the year. And we're therefore in a coping scenario now. We're no longer in, can we actually escape the impact of climate? It's there. So we're now in the age of adaptation. We've moved beyond the age of prevention in many ways. We can prevent it getting worse, but we probably can't prevent the kind of impacts that are already, in a sense, already programmed into the system of weather and climate and temperature today. So we're looking at disaster risk reduction, adaptation, and trying to ensure that the fragmentation that currently exists in not just Pakistan's systems of government, but most systems that are built up in most countries in a very sectoralized way, are brought together, because the response to climate, which in and of itself is a very connected framework of life and impact, cannot be addressed by sectoral approaches. You don't take silos when you're looking at a major fire. You can't say, okay, let the fire department take the left-hand side of the forest and the municipal department take the right-hand side. You're not going to put a fire out like that. You've got to deal with it all together. That's where integration comes in. That's where we need to move away from fragmentation. And all our national frameworks basically say that, whether it's the National Adaptation Plan, whether it's the Living Indus Plan, the NDCs, the DRR policy. The challenge is to really make that effective and work within the governance structure and our governance. The third bit that came up was governance and institutions, and that again relates to fragmentation. Any kind of climate crisis is a governance crisis. You have policies, implementation is always a challenge, whether it's from resources or whether it's just from bad organization or frankly incompetence, or a reluctance, a kind of put your head in the sand and hope the problem will go away. Or in political systems, well, we'll deal with it because we're only going to be around for 5 years, so what comes after is really not our problem or our responsibility or accountability. And I don't think that's really a particularly sensible way, because eventually if it's not your problem, it's going to be your children's problem and your grandchildren's problem. So the sense of taking a wider, more holistic and more responsible attitude is very much at the heart of good governance. And water governance is probably, again, at the heart of that. It's the Indus. The way we set up the governance mechanisms, the paradigm shifts. People have talked about the need to shift from agriculture to restoring our groundwater, to perhaps decommissioning a lot of our current irrigation system to a different kind of system, which is much more nature sensitive. the restoration of our wetlands, our delta, really looking carefully at, does the RBOD and the LBOD still serve the purpose? Or are they causing more problems than they're solving? Those are the very hard political, institutional governance decisions that I think are going to be in front of us, eventually have to be something that we deal with seriously. A lot of this will happen at the local government level, and community knowledge and the response of communities, stakeholders, farmers, the poor, is going to be very much part of whether we succeed or not. Because the levels of poverty, population didn't come up too often. But the reality is that it's only anywhere you can see economically in the world, it's only when you get a replacement rate of 2 to 2 that you actually see countries come out from major poverty. It's happened all over the world, it's historically clear, and that's something we really have to take on board. And obviously women and gender and the role they play in that sort of shift is essential. Climate finance, as I said, came up again and again. And whether you call it climate finance, whether you call it adaptation finance, ultimately this is development finance. It's essentially the way we have to change our economy and change our countries. And what was really, really cheering, certainly from somebody who's been a practitioner in the field for many, many decades, is how much we saw in this conference of the banks, the private sector, the ministries of finance, and the people who actually make the investment decisions. To me, that's been the most cheering aspect of this conference. If these people who are sitting in their offices are actually open to the kind of shift we're talking about, there is real hope for Pakistan. I think then you need to get the people make sure that they're held accountable to make those sorts of shifts. So, climate risk, for example, has to be a core development, a macroeconomic concern, not a peripheral humanitarian reactive issue. And, they've talked about Pakistan's green taxonomy, bankable projects, resilience-oriented investments. You've heard the MDB speak. I think the development community really needs to get behind the political push to make that happen. And as I said, water security, you had a whole session on the Indus, extremely well done. Every single problem was highlighted in that session. It was absolutely clear that we know what the problems are, we know what the solutions are, we even know where the money is. It's just a question of making it happen. And that's not to say it is not happening. I, work in all the provinces of Pakistan, and every single provincial government is in its ADPs now, putting aside 1%. You heard Mariam Nawaz this morning, putting aside 1% for some element of climate resilience and adaptation, whether it's forests, whether it's checking the PC1s as to seeing whether they've done the climate analysis, increasingly talking about the climate programs, the projects. It's happening. And hopefully there will come a sense of critical mass within the next decade, which will really show how much effort that was put in now and through conferences like this will show us results. There was a lot on our cities, on urban resilience. Again, if we continue to build in the floodplains of the Indus, if we do not manage our cities better, we have wonderful examples around the world. China has something called sponge cities. And every time I drive around Karachi, I think to myself, what a great example this would be. Lahore, sponge cities. There are canals going through it. There is a boat basin. There is a coastline. These are exactly the ingredients of water that you need to build a sponge city. It takes resources, it takes planning, and it takes some political will, but it can happen. Again, we have the landscape, we have the knowledge if we want it, and we have a very good partner in China that's willing to give green technology, which we heard about from some of our Chinese speakers here. Agriculture and food security, rural resilience. At the bottom of that is the question of land use. Who owns land? Who makes the decisions? What kind of crops you plant? And what kind of incentives continue to make us plant sugarcane? It's one of the worst crops in terms of water management in Pakistan. It's a quick win maybe, and for it makes a few people very rich, but ultimately it is destroying our water tables and our aquifers. So, again, a sense of responsibility, a need to make sure that that perverse incentives are not built into our system, that we're investing in crops, and somebody spoke that, you export these crops, you're exporting water. And this, again, is not a very sensible approach. Finally, there was talk about data, knowledge, innovation, a lot about green technology, about solar, how it's changing the landscape in terms of the possibilities of renewables, and how important it is to make sure the private sector is driving this process. That we look to government for the policies, the incentives, the necessary direction in the economy, but private sector has to drive it. And private sector is doing so as much as it can, and you heard, that they need to have a lot of policy changes to really let them not be so constrained by our current environment. And finally, as to Dawn and its conference, I'd like to just make a couple of points before I end, and I hope our next speaker is going to join us. The Jilani Saab is coming. Oh, good, okay. So, and I say this because before the first Dawn conference, when I was requested by some of them to come and talk about the way the conferences should be organized and how they should be focused, there was a question as to why would a media house take on the issue of climate change, except perhaps as, a news item. And what Dawn has shown is that, one, they can convene an enormous range of the best people in the country and regionally and internationally to speak to this issue. I've been extremely impressed by that. There are not many organizations that can do that. But then the partnership with the United Nations gives them the credibility and the access to the best global knowledge to actually back up the case that they're making, that Pakistan needs to take climate change seriously. In the first conference, I sensed that there were a lot of people who came along because, okay, maybe this is a one-off, it's interesting, let's see where it goes. There's been a fundamental shift in the kind of participation between that conference and this. We're now talking about solutions. The first conference spoke mostly about the problems and how they were impacting Pakistan. Second conference has really focused on solutions and how it could be made to work. And the finance minister was at both. You had a lot of politicians speaking at both. And as these sorts of conferences become a regular occurrence, I've seen that in other parts of the world, there becomes a reliance from the development community, from the climate change practitioners, to having these events with a regularity, because not just for networking and knowledge sharing, but they also become extremely important as part of the shift that a country makes towards a different kind of model of planning and development. So from that point of view, there's the Bao Forum that happens every year in China, there's Davos, there used to be the Delhi Development Summit, and I know that people started putting those in their diaries as they held them in their diary for annually attending. Now, if you keep this up, this could be an annual event, and in the longer term, that puts Pakistan on the map globally. Not just in terms of the country or the region, it puts us on the map as a place to come, to talk, to think, to understand how people are addressing the biggest challenge we face, frankly, for our planet and for our futures. So I'll stop there. If, Shakil, you're saying I can. I've given you the full report. If there's anything else, then I think questions should be taken to all the very, very dedicated people who've been around, midnight. I've seen the emails, 1 a.m., 3 a.m., writing notes. So big applause to all of them. It's their work.